of Jewish Communal Studies at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, the HUC-JIR in Los Angeles, where he also served as Dean of the campus from 2006 to 2010. He previously directed HUC's School of Jewish Communal Service, now the Zelikow School of Jewish Nonprofit Management. Before joining academia, Dr. Windmuller spent 3 decades in Jewish communal leadership, including as Executive Director of the Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles and as a Federation Director in New York. An expert on American Jewish political behavior, Jewish communal trends and civic affairs, Dr. Windmuller holds a doctorate in international relations from the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of Quest for Power, a study in Jewish political behavior, and In This Time and Place, American Jewry 3.0, and has published widely on Jewish public affairs, Latino Jewish relations, and global Jewish communities. His writings can be found at thewindreport.com. Dr. Windmuller has lectured internationally, including in China, Latin America, Israel, and Germany, and has served as a Nahum Goldman Fellowship Scholar. His contributions have been recognized with numerous awards, including an honorary degree from HUC-JIR, and he is married to Dr. Michelle Perlman Windmuller. And I'm honored that he joins us every year for I don't know how many years now, but we thank him. And please, let's give it up for Dr. Stephen F. Windmuller.
It's hard to speak on Yom Kippur between fasting and our moments of personal inquiry, the depths of our feelings, and in this particular year, our sense of great concern, loss, and more directly, the events this last 24 hours in England with the deaths of some fellow Jews simply because they were Jews practicing and being part of their community in Manchester. And only by that fact would they suffer the loss of life and 4 others who were injured. In this moment, Israel remains a very constant theme for us. Each year I come and I speak to you about the particular agendas or issues that have evolved for that particular moment in time. But this is different. We're living in a kind of point of both our own divisions over Israel as well as our collective concerns about its status, its role and reputation in the world, and the construct of what will happen in all of the events since the 7th of October 2023. As we approach the second anniversary of this moment, we realize the extraordinary and powerful impact of what this event has meant. In understanding the Israel story, we talk about it in the context of the Middle East as a whole and Israel as a player in a much larger arena. And one cannot talk about Israel in the past 30 years without talking about Iran, because Iran is the framer, the instigator of an array of issues and organizations that have sought to deny Israel its place and role in the Middle East. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Islamic Jihad, and we can name so many more. At any given time, there have been 7 different military fronts upon which the Israelis have had to respond to the Iranian agenda, if you wish. And in the context of that, it is important to realize that there's a counterpoint to Iran, the efforts by the United States to create the Abrahamic Accords, which have been a counterpoint to the influence, the power, and the role of Iran in the region. And in order to understand the importance of the Abrahamic Accords, we're about to see a new chapter in that hopefully emerge. But we need to unpack Hamas and Gaza for a few moments, because Israel's had a long history with Gaza. Remember, Gaza was not part of the partition. It was ultimately a throw-in by Egypt at the end of the 1967 Six-Day War. Gaza is about the size of Rhode Island, yet it has a population in excess of 2.5 million. It is the most densely populated piece of land on the earth. We need to understand that millions of people are impacted by the events that we are living with and have experienced. But we also need to step back, because Gaza was to become ruled in 2007 by Hamas. And Hamas has moved to entrench itself militarily, economically, and certainly politically as the core power in Gaza. And one needs to read the charter of Hamas. And if you haven't taken the time to do so, it is worthy of your understanding of what it represents. This is a religious fundamentalist structure that believes in the destruction of the state of Israel and the end to the Jewish people. So one has to realize the hatred here, the firmament of hostility that has been laid on the basis of what Hamas represents and is seeking or has sought to achieve. So on Simchat Torah 2 years ago, this event, the attack on the southern borders of Israel, the kibbutzim along the Gaza border. The attack was intended, according to Israeli intelligence, to have happened or should have happened on Passover of 2023, but was delayed for some 6 months in order for Hamas to ensure that it could deliver the tragic and deadly impact that it would have. Much of our focus has been on the hostages, as it ought to be. We believe there are 48 remaining, of whom 20 are alive at least. But their well-being and their safety and security has remained a core to all of these months and now years in which we have experienced this conflict. There were moments here in the diaspora and in Israel where we shared unity, where we found a kind of commonality around all of this. And on the 7th of November of 2023 and on the 11th of November of 2023, we saw American Jews in huge numbers, 200,000, gather in Washington to express that solidarity in the name of the hostages and in the name of a kind of unity between Israel and its global Jewish partners. But since then, there's been, as I call it here, a calling out, a kind of division and divisiveness in the Jewish community and even within Israel, over questions of methodology, military practice, over policies, over failed opportunities to secure release of hostages, over battles and over the construct of a war that has not gone necessarily well for the parties involved. The pushback has come to us from Generation Z and from college campuses and from governments and from a host of other institutions that have attacked Israel, marginalized the Jewish people, and created a new form of anti-Semitism about which we will speak. Israel has suffered significant military and civilian casualties in these 2 years. So that too is part of the framing of this moment. We are living with the 37th government of the State of Israel, led by Bibi Netanyahu, the longest-term serving prime minister in Israel's history. For some Israelis, he is the only prime minister they have lived with, that they have known. And for others, it is a moment of great despair, because the government that is now in power and the 7 parties that comprise the coalition of this government is the most right-wing nationalist government in Israel's history. So it has created this extraordinary challenge to how and what we are experiencing. Israelis in discord with their own government, demonstrating on the streets, and likewise a challenge from diaspora Jewry who question whether or not this is the Zionism that they understood and the belief system about Israel and its partnership with Palestinians for a 2-state solution, none of which may be on the agenda of this government. So it creates the Bibi Netanyahu era, which is an extraordinary moment in time because the Prime Minister has a very unique relationship with the United States, being born in the United States and therefore carrying a kind of special relationship to the political players in Washington and more directly with the current President of the United States. And that relationship is particularly significant. Even this week, we will have noted what has occurred and why that is so important. This administration, that is the Israeli administration, faces an election next year. It could collapse before the period of 2026, but it is required by Israeli law to face the public vote by the end of October of next year. So we may be living with a transitional government, and then again, we may simply be on the verge of another period of 4 years or more of this political regime. Casualty numbers, we are told, correct. The Gaza Health Authority tells us 66,000 Palestinians have died in this war. The Israelis counter that with numbers far lower. The starvation issues, were they caused by the United Nations and its relief agencies? Were they the impact of a failed American and global Red Cross initiative? Was it the fault of the IDF and the Israel efforts to provide food and other assistance? Was it Hamas's failure to make sure that that food was distributed and delivered appropriately? So the blame game is significant, and it is global, and it is terrifying in terms of the impact it has had on the lives of people and on the public relations story for Israel moving forward. Are there war crimes that were committed? Probably on both sides. Was genocide, in fact, a practice? Questionable. The international courts will continue to rule on this, and the Israelis will continue to respond, pushing back against such charges and articulating the case for why what they did was in self-defense and in protection of their citizens and their right as a nation to such actions. There are many primary characters and actors in this story. Hamas military is different from the Hamas General Command and General Services people. One group is in Gaza, the other is in Qatar. And we see a different outcome from both, which we'll talk about in a minute. And who's reporting on Gaza? Because very few reporters are actually on the ground in Gaza. So what we are getting are interpretive reports sitting in Jerusalem, or sitting in Beirut, or in Cairo, or sitting in Doha, or sitting anywhere else in the world. Reporters are creating stories where on the ground actual visual and direct connection is almost impossible. So part of the challenge here is what is truth? And how do we galvanize and fully appreciate what has happened and what continues to happen? The impact of this war is well beyond this small piece of land or even the state of Israel. It has profound implications for Jews sitting everywhere in the world, and beyond Jews, it has profound implications for governments who are seeking to deal with the fallout and the possibilities of what comes next in the post-Gaza conflict. The charges and countercharges will continue, because that's the nature of this kind of conflict, of both sides claiming right and both sides seeking the public stage. So we have a number of players well beyond the Middle East and also within the Middle East that we need to account for. Certainly we know about the role that the United States is playing, and more directly this week, as you may recall, on Monday, the President introduced a 20-point plan that the Israelis have in context accepted. We await Hamas's response to this proposal. If you've read the 20-point plan, it is really quite fascinating because it's very comprehensive and even speaks in the closing points to the idea of a Palestinian state, which the Israeli government at this moment is rejecting, but yet has adopted in principle this 20-point framework. What this plan calls for is for Hamas to demilitarize and to begin within 72 hours of its acceptance the immediate return of the hostages, and in turn Israel providing to the Palestinian Authority and to the international community a significant number of prisoners that it is holding both from Gaza but also from the West Bank. There are many stages to this 20-point plan, and if you haven't had occasion to read the outline of it, I urge you to do so. As of today, Israel, as I say, has accepted in principle the proposals. Hamas's leadership in Doha has also accepted it, but the military leadership of Hamas in Gaza has not yet accepted it. I was asked earlier by a person from the press whether I thought that this plan would be adopted by Hamas. And in all candor, in this room, I would tell you it is doubtful. Hopefully, there will be pressure on Hamas from various sources to accept the plan, because without it, we will continue to see the taking of Gaza City, the further destruction of lives, Israelis and Palestinians, and the further misery of folks as a result of war and terror. And it will simply accelerate what we already are living with. There are many interested parties. We know Iran for sure is an interested party as a supporter and backer of Hamas and the other groups we've discussed earlier. Egypt is clearly a partner interested in ending this conflict for its own interests, but as well for the broader interests of the region. And the Palestinian Authority, which has no use for Hamas and therefore would seek to end its influence and power in Gaza. Whether there will be serious disarmament, which is what the plan calls for, is still a question mark. But the plan does require the IDF to remove itself from the Gaza region, as well as I suggested earlier that Hamas demilitarize itself. The rebuilding and resettling of this area is the huge story, and it too is part of the 20-point plan that the Trump administration has put forward. And it is quite fascinating to see who those players will be, which will include Arab states, Europeans, the Japanese, and a host of other governments who will be called upon to assist the Israelis, the United Nations, and the United States in reclaiming, in a sense, Gaza and renewing life and the ability to live in a region that has been torn apart by conflict. The most important moment of this war occurred in 2 weeks, the 13th of June to the 24th of June of this year, Operation Rising Lion, which was the Israeli and US attack on Iran, and the importance of that in trying to destabilize both the government, but more directly have an impact on the nuclear capacity of Iran to arm itself and to be able to carry forward any kind of nuclear intervention. It was a transformational moment. It will be a significant moment because if we do see something from the 20-point plan, this will further isolate Iran as a role player in the region. This is also very significant to the United States because of Saudi Arabia. The ultimate goal of the United States in the Middle East is to bring Saudi Arabia closer to Washington, and to do so that must go through Jerusalem. In order for that to happen, there needs to be some kind of peace process to end the conflict and a step forward in terms of commitments by Israel to stabilize the Palestinian situation. The Saudis want a defense pact with Washington, and with that comes their buy-in to the Abrahamic Accords. So it's a two-part piece here. The Israelis get ultimate recognition from the Saudis. The United States gets a defense agreement with Saudi Arabia. And we have a shifting power relationship in the region with a major economic force, the Saudi Arabian regime. The other regime that we need to watch is Turkey, because the Turks have their own interests in the region, and they are testing those interests right now in Lebanon, and will do so again in Syria, on the basis that they want to create a greater Turkey. They want a return to the Ottoman days of the power of Istanbul as a kind of center of the Middle East. And that too has to be balanced and pushed back by efforts to change the equation. And part of that equation involves Syria. And Syria, for the first time in more than 3 decades, has open dialogue and discussions with Jerusalem. And that is an important outcome here. The United States began to push that several months ago, and now at the request of the United States, the Israelis have moved to open dialogue with the Syrians as well. What's going on in Lebanon is a fascinating story. With the defeat of Hezbollah and the weakening of Hezbollah, for the first time we are seeing in some 20 years the ability to return a government to Beirut to manage the economy, the economic and political scenarios of Lebanon, which should ease tensions between Beirut and Jerusalem, ultimately, and change the equation there. So there's a tremendous amount hanging on the events over these next several days with Hamas, impacting Saudi Arabia, with real implications for Syria and Lebanon. Having said that, there are 3 powers that are not necessarily pleased with or supportive of the efforts of the United States or the Israelis at this moment. The North Koreans continue to provide nuclear assistance to Tehran. The Chinese and the Russians are buying a lot of oil out of Iran, all of which is to prop up that regime, and all of which, of course, has implications for bringing yet another potential threat to Israel and the region should Iran be able to recapture some of its economic and military positions. So what has this diaspora experienced over these 2 years? We, collectively, have raised more money on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people over these past 23 months than we have ever raised on behalf of such purposes. 1.4 billion has been raised by various American and global Jewish charities to achieve the objectives of helping Israelis, dealing with diaspora security, and dealing with a host of issues that have grown out of this conflict. we are also looking at what is called the awakening. The awakening is an extraordinary experience we've seen over the past 2 years of literally thousands of Jews who were disaffected, disconnected from the Jewish community, who have returned to Jewish day schools, to synagogue affiliation, to federation giving, to National Jewish Organization affiliation, and a host of other ways by which Jews have come home, whether it was because of the events of the 7th of October, or whether it's tied to the anti-Semitism they are experiencing personally and collectively. That moment has generated this extraordinary return of significant numbers of Jews to community. What has also happened both in Israel and here in the diaspora is the rise of this extraordinary amount of poetry and literature and music dealing with the hostages, dealing with connections to Zionism and Israel, dealing with our emotional hopes and beliefs, even our fears and our frustrations. And then there have been significant numbers of trips to Israel run by various national and local Jewish groups, taking Americans and European Jews to Israel to assist in being on the ground, reaching out to the hostage families, working with the kibbutzim and the basis of the economy of Israel to assist at a time when more than 250,000 Israelis have been called up for military duty, thereby creating a vacuum in the economy of the state. And then there are the negative themes that we have lived with. Gen Zs, 18 to 25-year-olds, who've basically challenged us, basically said, this war is not our war, Zionism is not our cause, Israel has failed us. They have written their letters, they have organized their demonstrations, they have aligned with groups who have really radicalized a kind of no on Israel, support for BDS, boycott, divestments, and sanctions. As late as last night, the University of Maryland Student Association, picking Yom Kippur Eve to vote on a resolution 29-0 to call on the University of Maryland to stop all funding, support, and engagement with Israel, the university's ties to the academic institutions of Israel, and the government's investments with Israel as a way to, again, point to just one university and one campus situation in which we've seen this effort to isolate Israel even further. So the campus scene is significant. 550 events occurred between April and May of 2024 on college campuses, involving thousands of students demonstrating. Of all of those events, there were only 20 that were violent or had any element of violence, yet the events themselves symbolize the extent and anger and disconnect of younger people, Jews and others, on college campuses in connection with this story. 147 American universities have either taken actions against Israel or have been the scenes for most of the actions or activities against Zionism, Jews, and Israel. Creating this new anti-Semitism, and it is different. It looks at Jews as white people. It labels us as white. It suggests that we are power. We are part of the power establishment in this country and around the world, and that we operate in a context of being colonialist, apartheidist, and as a result, we are dismissed. We are seen as problematic to the future because we do not represent people of color, and we are not part of a world that is radically and rapidly changing. And as such, we are seen as part of the problem and certainly not the solution. The new anti-Semitism is tied to postmodernism. It's linked to a host of other issues that align minority communities together, where Jews are no longer perceived as a minority because we have become white. And it has changed the caliber and character of our relationships across different groupings and different settings here in this country and around the world. And this is a generational conflict. We see this sharply in all of the polling data we have, both about Americans in general and more specifically about Jews. Younger people in this country totally disconnected with Israel. And that is applied more definitively and directly to our own young people who feel far more alienated than any previous generation has felt with regard to Israel and Zionist connections. Sorry about that. We were almost at the end, so it doesn't really matter. The last slide asks 4 questions. Why not? 4 questions are perfect for a Jewish audience. And the questions deal with, so where do we go from here? How do we sort of manage all of this, taking apart each of those elements? So in the context of what we've talked about, how do we reinvent Zionism? How do we fight and manage anti-Semitism? In a third premise, how do we look at the Middle East and Israel beyond this conflict, assuming that we may have a moment of radical and particular change before us? And finally, what does it all mean for us? How do we sort of live in the world, a very different place in terms of building relationships, alliances, and connections with other groups, and how do we rebuild those connections moving forward? So on this Yom Kippur, we're no longer just talking about the achievements and the storyline of an Israeli society. We're talking about our own sort of status and state in the context of all of this. It is sober and it is challenging, but it is also an opportunity. It's a kind of distinctive moment in the Jewish story, the modern Jewish story. With that, I look forward to your questions, and let us hope that when we gather yet again in a year, we will have a very different outcome and storyline. So I don't know.
Okay, questions?
I got it. Is it on? I have to turn it on.
Just bring it out for just right now and then we'll
All right.
come back.
Thank you very much for coming every year and educating us. I was curious, the anti-Semitism you described happening in the U.S. and college campuses, is that happening all over Europe and other parts of the world as well? Or is it unique to us?
No, it's a universal phenomenon. It takes slightly different forms elsewhere, depending on the part of the world. In Europe, its implications and connections with the rise of Islam in Europe and its whole sort of power base there. In other parts of the world, it's more traditional forms of anti-Semitism. In Asia, for example, it's sort of tied to some of the old canards about Jews having too much power. And here in the United States, though, it's much more clearly defined by some of these new parameters, which is why when I write a kind of critique of the ways by which the national Jewish organizations are studying and managing anti-Semitism, which continues to be very traditional. And they use an 11-point guide. And it's all very interesting because the guide is tied to individual behaviors. Jews have too much power. Jews only befriend other Jews. Jews own banks. Jews are more loyal to Israel than the United States. And there are 11 of these. And according to the ADL, if you score 6 or more on these, you're an anti-Semite. And my argument is that's fine for a day and an age when we were looking at individual beliefs about Jews. This is not what people are talking about. They're talking about the collective Jewish people, the state of Israel, Zionism, and ideas that are much broader. So as a result, I think the measuring sticks are wrong, and the treatments, that is how we're fighting this, is totally wrong. And so I'm doing some work with national organizations now to rethink the framing of how we engage in response to a very different form of anti-Jewish outcomes here.
Again, Professor, thank you from all of us for being here. What is your opinion on the relationship with Trump and Netanyahu? How much influence does Trump really have on what's going on in the state of Israel? Thank you.
How much influence does the president really have? Well, I mean, I think he can actually maximize that if he wanted to by the control of U.S. arms to Israel, which is a powerful leverage point. He's not, introduced that. I just want to be clear, but that is the leveraging of when a country has some degree of influence over another, and certainly over the economic or military capacity. And I think that as long as the president believes that the Israelis are moving toward some of his objectives as defined in this 20-point plan, for example, that he will be open to being supportive of the prime minister and his actions. If the president gets too much pressure from both his own supporters or allies that they feel the Israelis have extended themselves too far, then I think he will put the lid on the IDF and on the prime minister's ability to continue to wage this conflict.
Thank you so much, Dr. Windmuller. It was a great presentation. You talk about what we have going forward in our relationship with Israel. And we're a congregation of Reform progressive Jews. And then I'm looking at the leadership of Israel right now, where you've got Ben-Gvir, who would like to take over the entire West Bank with settlers, and Smotrich, who doesn't even believe that Palestinians are a people. And I look at the far right-wingness of that, and Bibi Netanyahu being beholden to them. And I love the idea of the land. I love the idea of going to see the wall. But there's nothing that the leadership of Israel has that is relevant to me or that I want any part of. And how do we even relate to that? And we're asked to defend it by people that say, oh, but, Gaza, and they're starving, and the genocide. And I don't know how to defend that or relate to it. What do I do?
Rabbi?
I'm going to walk out.
You sit, as many Reform Jews, as many of us sit, in this uncomfortable place. Whether we like or dislike Bibi is almost secondary. But what sort of has evolved, what has happened, has changed sort of the character of Israel. And it's changed, as a result, some of our connections, our feelings, and our hopes for Israel. And so it creates this extraordinary moment where we struggle. On the one hand, the right of Israel to be able to defend and protect its people, for sure. And on the other, this uncertainty about the kind of leadership that Israel has now put forward through this particular government. And that raises these great challenges for us. I think what we continue to have to do is to share with our Israeli friends our passion for their right to be safe and secure, and our disgust or anger or concerns or whatever ways in which we describe it, our uncertainties for sure of where and how Israel is progressing or moving in terms of what it has become or might become. And it's reflected in the streets of Israel. You see those demonstrations weekly, whether it's around the hostage issue or the larger questions about Israel's democracy. So it's a debate which shows in the polls that the government does not have the support of vast numbers of people. The latest polls show the prime minister is way down in terms of popularity. But that depends in fact by the moment, because God forbid there is an Iranian attack or another kind of terrorist incident. And the Israelis will rally yet again, as they should and ought to defend and protect the nation. But it is this moment in time where we struggle with all of this. And we are seeing this play out in so many different ways. In our seminaries, our rabbinic students struggle with Israel and how they are either connect with or fail to connect with Israel. We see it in terms of national Jewish organizations where many of their members and some of their staff disagree with the policies of some of these organizations in terms of being supportive of Israel at a time when they are questioning Israeli decision-making. So this continues to be a difficult moment, but one where we cannot give up, where we need to be in the fight and engaged with the Israelis in this discourse.
You had mentioned in your closing remark that we were promoting the successes of Israel. And I recall coming here for a gazillion years and seeing these little books that spoke about the success and successes of Israel, and we created this and we helped with that. And all the while, I was extremely upset with that because all this time BDS was being created, et cetera, et cetera. I personally have been talking to friends, but you being someone who could maybe who has a bigger audience, perhaps I have been talking about publicity, public relations, et cetera, whether it means hiring a Fifth Avenue advertising agency. This is Hollywood. One would think they can promote a movie. One would think that Israel can afford a few dollars to hire some very important PR firms.
I did not plant this question. I did not. So you may have seen on Monday, the same day that the 20-point plan was released, that the Israelis announced, very quietly, interestingly enough, that they had signed an agreement with a series of communications and PR firms, expending almost $1 billion toward an investment in Hasbara, in information development, in the PR campaign that you are calling for. It's way late, and it was needed and has been needed for well beyond and prior to the 7th of October, but it is now at least in play. And I will tell you that communications experts have been talking to the government of Israel for years about this question. And the Israelis claim, yes, they understand, but they don't think it makes a difference. Well, for whatever reason, someone has reached the highest authorities in Israel to say, you cannot continue without a master plan for delivering your messages, your identity, and in pushing back against untruths, misrepresentations, whatever, and to reframe this debate and this story. Now look, we know between Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and a host of other investors, including the Iranians, millions of dollars are going into American universities, into the BDS movement, into a host of other institutions to create their storyline. Now, we may not be able to compete in dollars, per se, but we need to do, and they need to do, a much better job in terms of reframing their case, and this is the first step.
3 more questions.
Thank you, Blaine. I've listened to a lot of comments and a lot of questions. What concerns me, this gentleman here kind of took a little bit what I was thinking. What is driving politics today is social media, not traditional think tanks or whatever have you. I think we're and the Israelis are very good at social media. I think their psyche is it doesn't matter what we do, we're always going to get crapped on, for lack of a better term. I think also the American media is doing us no favors. They report falsehoods continuously, and then if they realize they made a mistake, back maybe 20 pages, they'll put a little blurb, oh, we made an error on this. And there have been numerous occasions. I'm not saying that the Israelis are perfect. They're human beings just like we are. But I don't know of any other country in the world that sends flyers down where they're going to attack. That is so unmilitarily bright. But they do it for compassion and not recognized. The other point I would make, where they could really score, is whenever there's a disaster in the world, the Israeli Mogen David is there. Perfect example is Haiti, when they had their earthquake. The first hospital there were the Israelis. Nobody does what they do. And I think social media, you don't need big bucks to create social media. And I think that could be the answer, just like for the party that's out of power right now.
Thank you. With regard to the problems that you so adequately discussed, can you reflect for a moment on the American political spectrum and the future of our political spectrum, Democrats, Republicans, far left, far right, and are we facing increasing problems that are typified by the dilemma in New York with Mandami?
Rabbi, the question deserves an hour and a half worth of good conversation. So I'll do my best in 2 minutes.
Push all right fast.
I'll do my best. So first of all, read my book, The Impact of Donald Trump on American Jews in Israel, USC 2021. That was the year it was published, the first Trump. The second Trump is very different from the first, so I have to now write a second book for sure. This is a very different moment in time for American Jews and for the United States. And all I will say in this very brief comment, because this is a day of reflection and not a day of politics, is that we need to be fully cognizant that what is happening in this country is so fundamentally different from what we have experienced at any point in our lives that we have to come to grips with what its implications are for us, first of all. And secondly, what are the possible ways by which people will respond? And I don't mean just how Jews will respond, but how Americans will respond. And some of that will be simply in the polling booths, where people will either endorse this or oppose it, but other parts of this will come to us on the street. And we're likely to see some very messy street action in this country over the next year and a half. And I think we just have to be prepared for that. And we have to also be prepared for civil disobedience of other forms, because people are beginning to realize that their sense of who they are, their freedoms, and their sense of security really facing a very different chapter in their lives. And so it deserves a much richer answer than I've just given you, but for a day such as today, we'll just leave it there. Thank you so very much.
No, it's fine.
We have one more.
Okay,
I'm good.
It's
we're good.
fine. We're done.
All right. Let's give it up for Dr. Stephen Wynn-Mueller.